So welcome everybody. My name is Roy Schwartz. I handle marketing and biz development for Vishnik McGovern Milizio. I would like to wish you happy Pride, first of all. And second, welcome to the first of a series of webinars during Pride Month, joint webinars of Vishnik McGovern Milizio and Northwell Health, dedicated to LGBTQ health and life planning matters. The webinars are all going to be on Thursdays between 5 and 6 plus Q&A, and each is dedicated to a different topic. In the chat, I just sent a link for more information and for registration to all future webinars. We will be announcing more as well as more exciting things soon. To begin, I'd like to introduce Joe Milizio. If you don't know, Joe is the managing partner of VMM. He's the Milizio and Vishnik McGovern Milizio. He also heads our LGBTQ representation practice, which was one of the very first in the United States many, many years ago. He also heads, he co-heads the surrogacy, adoption, and assisted reproduction practice, which will be featured in another webinar, and is a key member of our matrimonial and family law practice. Joe, please.
Thank you very much, Roy, and welcome everyone. I just saw an entry in the chat that the sound is a little difficult, so maybe you can take a look at that, Roy, in the interim. In any event, welcome everybody. Happy Pride. This is a great month to be doing these presentations because we are able to hopefully provide some information that people desperately need. And hopefully we're able to provide just some additional information that you might want to use either now or as a resource for the future. So keep things in mind as we go through our various topics for today, because you never know when something will be pertinent. Even if it's not pertinent today or tomorrow, it might be pertinent next week or the week after that. So we are happy to always provide as much information as we can to our clients, to the general public, and to the LGBT community as it stands. So I think we'll go right into it so that we're not hesitating at all. And I would like to introduce Dr. David Rosenthal as our initial speaker. And what can we say? Dr. Rosenthal is a great doctor. How's that? He is a leader in the LGBTQ community, to say the very least, but his credentials are long and very impressive. So David Rosenthal, DO PhD, is an allergy and immunology and internal medicine specialist at Northwell Health. He's the medical director of the Center for Young Adult, Adolescent, and Pediatric HIV Care, the Center for Transgender Care and Sexual Health, HIV, PrEP, and STI program at Rego Park. Additionally, he's an attending physician at the Division of Allergy and Immunology in Adult, Adolescent, and Pediatric Allergy and Clinical Immunology. And he is an assistant professor of medicine and pediatrics at the Donald and Barbara Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra Northwell. David, thank you very much for participating with us, and I will leave it with you.
Sounds great. It's really a pleasure, Joe, and it's always a pleasure being with you and kind of talking about these issues. I'm very excited that we can put together the this series to really kind of have this conversation, talking about both the medical issues as well as the legal issues that are really affecting the LGBT community, because I think that there are some very unique issues that we need to look at. And just like there's a lot of healthcare that is very generic for all individuals, regardless if you're part of the LGBT community or not. And there's a lot of law that's very generic, but there's also certain parts of healthcare and law that are very specific that address certain unique needs of the community. And it's really important that we can find practitioners that can take care of those needs, both in the medical and legal fields, and that you can get those kinds of the kind of advice and direction that you need that really matches the specific needs that you have. And I think that's one of the reasons why I was so excited when we were able to kind of talk about the series and bring these resources together, was as ways that we could talk about addressing different parts of the community and addressing things that we can bring up together. Today we're going to talk a little about LGBT health. At least I'm going to introduce things with that part. And I want to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of a journey that we've been on. I want to kind of teach and talk as we're going. So one of the things that I do is that we're able to, increase knowledge about LGBT health among physicians and among providers, because the reality is that unfortunately, there's a lack of knowledge and education when I went to medical school about the LGBT community and the resources we need to provide. And we need to make sure that we are addressing unique needs, because the fact is that if we always assume heteronormality within healthcare, then we're really not providing adequate healthcare or the proper healthcare for individuals that are part of the community. So a lot of things are very, very similar. If you're having a heart attack, then it doesn't really matter what your gender identity or sexual orientation is. But if we're talking about other parts of your health or whatever, we're talking about the importance of certain screenings for cancer or certain other resources. We need to make sure that we're addressing those screening principles and those elements of healthcare to your specific needs. And if we just stick our heads in the sand and presume everyone has heteronormative sex or whatever, and that they're in cisgendered relationships, then we're really not going to be providing the best healthcare that we can be providing. So one of the passions and the work that I'm doing is really to educate both the current generation and next generation of providers about how to really make sure that that healthcare can be there and we can provide those resources for individuals. So let's talk about a few of the things that we're seeing. One of the challenges that we run into is we know that there are certain health disparities that exist within the community that we really need to make sure that we're looking at. And one of those challenges is that we find that people do not necessarily seek healthcare as often as they need to. Maybe they've had poor experiences with healthcare settings. They found doctors that they can't talk to. They have relationships that really have not been able to address their needs. And they feel that the whole experience of going to the doctor does not necessarily address their identity. And it feels like a very foreign place. And this is what I hear from a lot of individuals from the LGBT community, is that I went to the doctor, they asked me a bunch of questions, they talked about things, they didn't really talk to me about what was going on in my life and my needs or whatever. And so I decided, well, you know what, I don't need to go back. And what I'm saying as a physician is we have to change that paradigm. The most important thing you can do is find a doctor that you can talk to and that can address your healthcare needs. Someone asked me a question, he said, what if I have a doctor that I don't feel like is addressing my needs or can do what's going on? And the answer that I gave back is find another doctor. Because you've got to find someone that can understand you. And I'm not sure if Joe would be able to give the same advice from a legal perspective, but if you're talking about making end-of-life decisions and you're talking about where you want your fortune to transfer to, whatever, if you can't have a conversation with the person who you're doing estate planning with that understands your needs, then you need to find a provider that can really understand you and can make sure they're meeting your needs and not plugging you into a standard document that they've used for cisgendered heterosexual couples that they've used across the board. And I'm sure Joe will talk about that much more as we get into this conversation. So I guess my ask is that while we want to make sure that everyone is receiving the same kind of care and receiving kind of equitable resources, we really want to also make sure that the unique needs of every community and population are being met, and that we understand that there are different and unique challenges for every individual and for every person, and that you can make sure that you're aligning yourself with providers that can provide that kind of care. Let's jump into some of the issues. So one of the things that we talk about is for individuals that are lesbians, they typically are not necessarily getting mammograms and other preventative health care as frequently as they need to. So it's very simple to do. The problem is people feel, well, you know what, I don't need to worry about it. I may or may not have carried a child. I may or may not be worried about this part, but they don't necessarily do the preventative health care that they need. And so it's really essential that we know that we're seeing higher incidence of breast cancer. And I'm actually going to be speaking with the American Cancer Society on this topic in just a few weeks within the health system. But it's really important that we're able to address these cancer prevention risks and are able to talk about these things. The way I talk about body parts is that if you have those parts, you need to screen those parts. So it doesn't matter if you're same-loving or if you're same-sex loving or other sex loving, if you're cis or you're trans, if you have breasts, we need to make sure that they're healthy. And so it's really important that we screen for breast cancer and do that. It's the same thing regarding other gonads or whatever. We need to make sure that we're taking a look and doing self-testicular exams for individuals that are male or that have male genitalia. And we're also really important that we're talking about doing other screening practices that are important. So if it's time for you to get your prostate screening done, then you need to do that either through a blood test or through other kind of, or through a digital rectal exam. And so it really is important that these routine preventative healthcare measures that we typically apply across the board are something that we make sure happen to us. And that means we need to see a doctor and have a relationship with a provider that we can look at these things. Let's change gears. For individuals that are younger, the HPV vaccine is really important. So the human papilloma vaccine actually prevents transmission of HPV. It can actually be very effective against 9 different types or subtypes of the human papilloma virus. And HPV can cause cervical cancer. It can also cause throat cancer or anal cancer, and other kinds of papillomas. I actually got my PhD studying HPV immune responses in the airway. And so it's essential that we are able to take a look at a preventative methodology to prevent transmission of HPV. So one of the ways to do that is to really look at getting your preventative HPV vaccine. You may have already been exposed to HPV at some point, but there's already 9 types of HPV in this vaccine. And so you should talk to your provider about receiving the HPV vaccine and looking at things. We're talking about vaccination. So I think for everyone right now, we need to talk about preventative healthcare. I'm an advocate of the COVID vaccine. I think it's really essential that people are able to get the COVID vaccine regardless of what's going on, and really that you're able to talk to your provider. The best advice I can give my patients, or the advice that I give my family, I tell my family that they should get the COVID vaccine, and that's what's happened to my parents and to my immediate family, as well as to my in-laws. And I think it's really important that people consider ways that they can keep themselves safe. If you have questions about it, talk to your doctor, talk to your provider, figure out what's going on, and understand what's happening so we can make sure that there's data that's out there and we can address your concerns and your practices. Let's switch over to individuals that are gay men. We really want to make sure that we're providing appropriate health for yourself. One thing we need to do, and we teach a lot of younger individuals, that we need to make sure that you're using protection, and that you're also using lube when you're having sex, because we want to make sure that you're having safe sex and having sex that's not going to cause problems. And if you have concerns about any part of your body or symptoms that you're having, then you need to make sure you're getting evaluated to make sure that we can address what's going on and take care of anal rectal health, and make sure that we're doing what we need to do to make sure that you're healthy and that you can have healthy outcomes and things like that as well. So this is really important that we talk about things. I think that it's essential that we're able to look at these issues and be able to understand what's going on and be able to kind of comprehend and address some of these things as well. And then I want to kind of jump over into transgender individuals, and we've opened the Center for Transgender Healthcare here at Northwell Health to take care of folks that are trans, gender nonconforming, and non-binary. And this is a very diverse group of individuals that makes up somewhere around 0.1 to 0.5% of the American population. In New York, we think that the LGBT community, at least according to the Williams Institute, makes up 5.1% of the New York state population, and probably higher out here in the New York metro than in the middle of New York. And so we're talking about a significant proportion of individuals. And so when we're talking about healthcare for the LGBT community, I always say that if you're looking at a room and there's 100 people in the room, we're talking about 5 individuals in that room that probably are members of the LGBT community. So this is not an insignificant proportion, and obviously you're here because you're interested in part of this community, but it's really important that you can find providers and practitioners that can address this need. Regarding trans individuals, I think that it's important that we take care of your healthcare and we figure out what's going on. There are safe ways to make sure that you can get hormone-affirming therapy and surgeries, as well as hormone-affirming or surgery that's gender-affirming. But it's important also that you see healthcare providers that are going to provide the right kind of healthcare. They're not doing things that are going to be experimental unless you're aware of that's something you're looking for. But really, mostly that we're doing things that are well proven and evidence-based, giving you treatments that are going to help you be your true authentic self and make sure that your gender identity can be something that you can feel healthy about and happy about. Finding providers with experience and expertise in all these things is really important. And the last thing I'm going to kind of pivot towards is going to be HIV and HIV prevention. It's really important for us to understand a few different concepts about HIV and HIV prevention. One, if you have HIV, then you can be treated, you can live a long, normal, healthy life with a lifespan that's absolutely normal. There's really no challenges or difficulties. It's a chronic disease, unlike before. Just like we treat asthma or diabetes is the way we're looking at HIV. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that we help you get your diagnosis made, that you get tested, that you're able to be evaluated, and that if you have HIV, we're able to treat you so you can be living with HIV and live a long, healthy life. But more importantly, it's important for us to understand there's two prevention modalities for HIV. One of them is called PEP and one of them is called PrEP. So when we take a look at things, PEP is sort of like an oops, something happened. So if a healthcare employee is stuck with a needle on their finger, or if a healthcare employee ends up having issues or challenges with other things, let's say they have blood-to-blood contact or something like that, a splash, or if you have a sexual assault situation, or if you have consensual sex, but there was no condom and you're worried about possibly getting HIV, then the clock starts immediately. And you need to try to get on PEP or post-exposure prophylaxis as soon as possible by talking to your doctor or going to the emergency room. Ideally, we can start it within 2 hours. It's important that it started within 36, and after 72 hours, there's no proven benefit for post-exposure prophylaxis. But what this does is it provides an opportunity to stop HIV and to be extremely effective at preventing transmission of HIV from one person to another. This is sort of like Plan B, if you're thinking about pregnancy prevention. We call it Plan B because it's not Plan A. You didn't mean for this to happen. This is what happened, but as a result, you've got to do something quickly. Otherwise, you're not going to have an opportunity to make that happen. But the more preventative modality that we encourage, and I kind of make the analogy to birth control or something like that, is a preventative modality. You know what you want your outcome to be. Let's say you want to remain HIV-free, and you feel that you're going to be participating in something because you're meeting people on Grindr, or you're hooking up with people, or you're having multiple relationships, and you want to make sure that you remain healthy. So what we need to do is we need to talk about a preventative modality that's able to prevent you from getting HIV. I always say that if you get gonorrhea or chlamydia, it doesn't come from the toilet seat and it doesn't come from the sky. It has to come from somewhere. So the thing is that if you get one of those things, then you could also have gotten HIV in the same way. And so it's time to kind of do some self-reflection and some self-thinking to say, what can I do to keep myself sexually healthier and to make sure that I'm addressing my sexual practices? I want to be happy. I want to be healthy. I want to make sure that I'm being intimate the way I want to be, but I want to also make sure that I'm keeping myself as safe as possible. So PrEP is one pill once a day. It's 92 to 98% effective at preventing transmission of HIV. And it's a really great option to be able to talk about ways to prevent HIV and to keep yourself safe, along with all the other stuff that we talk about. So that's kind of a high-level overview about some of the specific needs or specific questions that we're looking for the LGBT community, looking at preventative health, taking a look at what's going on. I obviously encourage everyone to make sure you're getting your colonoscopies and your anal rectal exams as you need to as part of your routine health care, depending on your age, and also that you kind of receive the updated information that you need regarding vaccination to see if you need it. People need their tetanus shots every 10 years, and none of us are good at remembering when that was. So just remember to take a look and to ask your doctor or provider to kind of see what's going on and take a look at these preventative methodologies so that you can make decisions that are right for you, that can be happy and healthy and can really help you address the healthcare you need. But the number one modality that I think we need to remember is that find a provider that you can talk to, have a conversation that you can have find a provider that you can have that conversation with to talk about what your sexual practices are. If it's an open relationship, if it's a closed relationship, if you're with multiple people, if you're with one individual, whatever your choices are, there are ways that we can make sure that we can address those healthcare needs in a sex positive manner and to really make sure that you're receiving the kind of healthcare that you need that addresses your sexual practices as well as your overall health. And that's what we really need to take a look at. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about substance abuse in the LGBT community. And unfortunately, we see a higher number of people that do smoke cigarettes, drink alcohol, use methamphetamines and heroin in the LGBT community demographically. And this is a real challenge. And so we need to make sure that we're able to address those issues, look at those issues, figure out how we can decrease our risk, and then do what we need to do to make sure we can move forward. And last but not least, I think my last topic that I'm going to talk about before I hand it back over to Joe is the issue of mental health. Because when we're thinking about mental health, this has been a very challenging year with COVID. We've had to change and turn upside down our current lifestyles, the way we interact with people, the way we socialize, who we see when we see people, and how we understand. And so I think what this has done is really highlight the mental health crisis that's going on in the United States right now, and how we really need to make sure that we do receive mental health care that addresses our needs, and really can make sure that we can find ways to address that. And I think that's true of the LGBT community, and it's true of the non-LGBT community. but it is essentially important that we're able to make sure that we can address our anxiety, address our depression, make sure that we can find ways to cope with stimulus and challenges that come our ways. And also we can always continue to do better. There are times when I've joked, and this is a joke, please, that we should just put a little bit of SSRIs or a little bit of antidepressant medication in the water supply. Because I think that what it does is it really is something that's helpful. But in all reality and in all factuality, what we need to be doing is we need to address and understand people's mental health needs and address them either through therapy, through talk therapy, through cognitive behavioral therapy, or through medication, or a combination to really address those needs and bring them together. So hopefully these kind of topics together provide a kind of a gloss or an overview of some of the issues that we need to look at. And if you do need any other resources, you can always reach out. If you want to reach my team, you can always reach us at prep@northwell.edu. Or you can also reach us for Center for Trans Care at northwell.edu. Or you can also email us at lgbthealth@northwell.edu. And you'll be able to get members of my team that can help you and address you to the right kind of medical providers and help guide you with the direction that you're looking for. And with that, I'm going to hand things back over to Joe.
And thank you very much, Dr. Rosenthal. That was really very informative and gave me pause for thought in so many different areas as to how people are actually handling their sexual health and what the best measures are for somebody when they're seeking to be properly treated. And obviously, as you've indicated, you need to go to the person or the people who know, the specialists, the people who have devoted their entire practice or their professionalism to the community, to sexual health, to undertaking the healthcare of the community. And I'm going to parlay that right into the legal profession to say that 20 years ago, when I first came out, I did not know where to turn when doing family planning and estate planning and general life planning. And I did my searches, did my asks, asked friends, et cetera, and nobody seemed to know an attorney who was freely accessible within the community and had knowledge of the community from a legal perspective and how to go about making sure that people within the community were adequately protected and that they're adequately covered from a legal perspective in so many different ways, and I'll get to a lot of those ways today. So I said to my business partners, I want to start an LGBT practice within the firm, and they looked at me kind of strangely and said, well, okay, we're not exactly sure what that is. And 20 years later, we are working with the community for family law matters, for agreements between partners, for adoptions, for surrogacy and assisted reproduction, which just recently became available in New York due to recent law changes. We can now undergo those procedures in New York, whereas previously it was illegal. So we also work with the community with respect to estate planning and life planning, which I'll get into what that is in a minute. As well as various actions for discrimination, employment discrimination, community discrimination, things along those lines. So we've taken that LGBT practice area, and although it's not limited to one specific area of the law for the community, it encompasses a great many areas of the law that we've learned to adapt to the needs of the community and make sure that the community is protected through those adaptations. So what do we do for you as a community member? Well, first, we tell you that your life planning has to be in place. And people normally look at me like that and they say, well, what do you mean by life planning? Well, life planning is a necessity if you're going to have adequate estate planning, because unless your life is being run in a proper fashion with all the benefits that you can possibly achieve, then your estate plan is really inconsequential, because your estate plan only follows after your life ends. So what's the sense in having a great estate plan if you don't have a great life plan? So life plan involves thinking about and acting to counteract the effects of what would happen if you should become ill, if you should become incapacitated, if you should have an inability to just make your own decisions, be it healthcare decisions or financial decisions or business decisions, things along those lines. And also making sure that your family members, your significant others are protected and would be adequately cared for should illness or incapacity or death occur. So what we do is when I sit down with somebody who comes into me and says, I need a will or I need a healthcare proxy or something like that, I start from the beginning and I send them a questionnaire with respect to general things that are going on in their lives, who their family members are, who their significant others are, their financial affairs, their health insurance, their life insurance, things along those lines. And we make sure that the person thinks about what would happen should they become incapacitated, not only, again, from their own perspective, but from their family's perspective. Will there be sufficient income to keep the family going, to keep children, spouses, partners, other family members that they might live with going in the same fashion that they have received or have been used to throughout their prior lives? So we're looking at life insurance. Life insurance is a very important aspect of life planning. And when you're a part of the transgender community, you have to give that special significance. Significance from really a timing perspective, because life insurance carriers will look at your application depending upon where in your life you may stand from a physical perspective. So if you're contemplating having gender confirmation surgery, for instance, you're going to want to plan to file a life insurance application prior to undergoing that surgery, because most life insurance companies will put you on hold until subsequent to the surgery, to make sure, not from the surgery perspective, but to make sure that the risk has been taken care of, because any surgery does have its attendant risks. So if your life insurance company knows that you're planning on some type of surgery prior to your life insurance becoming effective or immediately after your life insurance becoming effective, you want to make sure that they're not going to have those questions, those concerns. You don't need to go through all the explanations just to put a life insurance policy into place. And it's the same thing with a disability policy as well. Although disability policies are often offered through employers and they're greatly discounted if it is an employee perk as well. And as far as employment is concerned, I just want to mention that for anybody that's seeking employment, they should do their due diligence, because there are a number of employers throughout this country, throughout the world, in New York and elsewhere, who do in fact provide all sorts of benefits to the LGBT community, to transgender individuals. And those benefits are great when somebody is seeking to have a medical procedure done, to have life-confirming surgery done, anything along those lines, medications. If you have an employer who not only offers, but provides positive reinforcement for all of those types of benefits, that's the kind of employer you want to work for. So HRC, for instance, has a corporate equality index. You should be looking at that when you're looking for a job. You should do your due diligence. See if they have employee resource groups. See if they have diversity, equity, and inclusion groups, and make your decision not only based upon the type of job that you're interviewing for, but the type of company that you're interviewing for as well. So what are the other life planning legal aspects that I work with clients on? Well, a healthcare proxy is probably the most pertinent for this situation, for this seminar, because as Dr. Rosenthal will tell you, if you can make your own healthcare decisions, he will abide by those decisions. The problem is when you cannot make decisions for yourself. So if you are incapacitated, if something happens during a surgical procedure and you can't make your own decisions, and you're going to want somebody to make those decisions for you. And you don't want a relative who the hospital might talk to make those decisions necessarily. You might want to appoint your partner. You might want to appoint a good friend as opposed to a relative. At the worst, you don't want to have a hospital or a healthcare institution have to go into a special committee and potentially seek a court order just to have a procedure done, which could benefit your and extend your life for that matter. So a healthcare proxy allows you to appoint any third party to make healthcare decisions for you, again, should you not be able to make those decisions. Second document that I often suggest is a healthcare proxy and a living will. That goes with the healthcare proxy. So a living will provides that should you be suffering from an incurable illness, you would not want to be kept alive by artificial means of support. Now, there is no statute in New York specifically providing for the right to die. However, healthcare providers will, in fact, take your wishes into account when making those determinations, and obviously a written document to that effect will have great weight. A power of attorney. A power of attorney is not necessarily healthcare related. It allows a third party or other individuals to make other decisions for you, such as financial decisions, such as gifting decisions. If you should be in a position where you have to apply for Medicaid at some point in your life and can't do that on your own, an agent under a power of attorney will be able to take the necessary steps together with your attorney in qualifying you for Medicaid through various steps that they can take or undergo utilizing a power of attorney. A power of attorney will also allow your agent to do financial affairs for you, write checks, make withdrawals from your investment accounts, things of that nature. And finally, be able to coordinate health insurance benefits, which obviously are very important in all of our healthcare situations. So those are the essential life planning documents that I always suggest. And then, of course, we get into estate planning for our post lifetimes. And what is the necessity for having an estate plan? Well, if you don't have a plan and if you don't have the proper documents in place, New York law will control. If you don't live in New York, the state where you live will always control. It's not up to the federal government to make these decisions. It's up to each individual state where you reside. So, like every other state, New York has its own rules when it comes to the disposition of your assets should you not have a will, otherwise called intestacy. So when you die intestate, the state will say which relatives, blood relatives only, inherit your assets and how that works. So from an inheritance perspective, if you are survived by your parents, let me take one step back. If you're survived by your spouse receives everything. If you are survived by a spouse and children, your spouse receives the first $50,000 of your assets and 50% of the balance, and your children receive the other 50%. So think about that for a minute. Your spouse ends up with essentially 50% of your assets, and your children end up with the other 50% of your assets. Now, I know when I was a kid, I always used to say to my mother, I need this, I need that, I need money for this, I need an allowance, I need an increase in my allowance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And my mother would say, yeah, go out and get a job, go do something, I'll think about it next week. But if your child has an amount of assets that are equal to yours because their parent died without a will, that's going to create a conflict situation between your children and your surviving spouse. So you never want to put your family in that situation. Instead, you want a will that's going to say, this is how I want my assets to pass. And if you're not married, then your assets by intestacy laws will pass first to your parents, and if your parents don't survive you, then to your siblings, and if your siblings don't survive you, then the state will make a decision based upon any near or close heirs that you might have in the form of cousins and things of that nature. And obviously, if you don't have any of those relatives, it cheats to the state. But in our community, we often don't want our blood relatives to inherit. Sometimes we want our partners to inherit. And in that situation, you have to give a lot of thought as to how you would want your partner to inherit your assets. I have people come in all the time and tell me, oh, I want to leave everything to my partner if I die before him, and hopefully my partner is going to leave everything to me if he dies before me. And that's fine, and that's a first step, but they don't look at step number 2. And step number 2 is, okay, what happens upon your partner's death or the second party's death? And if you just leave your assets outright to someone, then that party has the right and the ability and will in fact leave those assets that are remaining at his or her death to whoever he or she chooses. So I often suggest that people think about trusts for their spouses and their significant others. And what a trust would do, it would say, well, okay, I leave all of my assets to my partner, but in trust for his lifetime. And during his lifetime, he will receive sufficient assets to provide for his health, his maintenance, his support, and his quality of life. But upon his death, whatever is remaining from the assets that I have left him will go back to my family, or will go back to my significant friends, or will go back to the charities that I care about, and not necessarily go to his family, his friends, and his charities. So it's significant planning that often we don't think about in the heterosexual society when we're doing estate plans, who leave everything to their spouses and then subsequently leave everything to their children. So if you are estranged from your family members, as many people within the community are, you don't want to have a will that does not specifically reference your family members. And I'm not saying you have to leave them anything, but you have to be cognizant of the fact in your document that you know you have family members and that you intentionally omitted them from your will. Because every member of your family, again, blood relatives, will receive notice of the probate of your will and have the right to object to your will based upon outside circumstances such as undue influence or inability to recognize what you were signing and what you were doing when you prepared and signed your will. So you want to specifically state, if you want to cut your relatives out, that I am cognizant of the fact that I have a brother by name of, and I have a sister by name of, and I have parents, etc., but I am not leaving them anything because I am leaving everything to, as an example, my life partner. And that will, in a court's eyes, state that person knew what he or she was doing. They did not just by chance omit their blood relatives from their inheritance provisions. And what about marriage? People say, oh, I'm married now. We have marriage rights, right? I was waiting for that. I got married 5 or 6 years ago, and my spouse is now going to inherit everything. That's not necessarily what you might want either. Spouses, especially in the LGBTQ community, often have their own assets that they've saved for many years, sometimes inheritance from parents, things of that nature, and they don't necessarily need to inherit your assets. Perhaps they do, perhaps they don't, but the conversation should certainly take place. And if you feel that as a joint family that your spouse does not need to inherit your assets, then you can make other provisions. Now, that being said, you can't disqualify your spouse from receiving assets. You can't disinherit a spouse by law unless that spouse specifically agrees. So we would need to have the spousal consent, and you have the documentations in place that allow for that as well. People also say, I've been with my partner for 32 years. I just had that this morning, 32-year relationship. Unfortunately, her partner passed, and they can't find the original will. They have no idea of what happened to this document. And although we have a copy of the will, and the copy specifically says that the decedent left everything to her partner, without an original will, a court is not going to accept that document for probate. And unfortunately, the surviving sister is probably going to receive everything, and the partner who should have been the sole inheritor is most likely not going to receive anything in that situation. So it's very important that you prepare properly, have the right documents in place, and make sure that you know where those documents are when it comes down to it. Civil unions, domestic partnerships, other relationships, no matter how long-term they are in New York, don't mean anything from an inheritance or a legal perspective. It's a relationship which has no bearing other than perhaps for qualifying for spousal benefits in the form of health insurance and employee benefits. It really has no bearing from an inheritance perspective. So you need a will if you feel that your relatives who you're disinheriting might give your survivors a hard time. Then we would also suggest something such as a revocable living trust, which avoids probate and allows your assets to be passed pursuant to that documentation, without having anybody receive a copy of your will through the probate process, which would give them the right to contest your will as well. So what do you need to do from a planning perspective for your estate plan? Well, first you need to find the attorney that's going to know what needs to be done. As Dr. Rosenthal said, you need to know or find the physician in the healthcare institution that's going to provide and know what to look for your healthcare concerns. You need to do the same with an attorney. So that attorney, first of all, must be located or have the ability to be licensed to practice within your state of residence, and has to be familiar with the issues which will arise for members of the community. You need to sit down with that attorney and make sure the attorney is taking the time to arrange a meeting or a Zoom or whatever is necessary to go through your thoughts, your relationships, your family, your loved ones, to know your situation. You need to discuss the documents that you might have in place already and the benefits that you've achieved through life planning, such as life insurance and disability insurance, and any benefits that you might have from your employer, in coming to terms with what you're doing for your estate plan as well. And we need to look at things like 401k plans and the beneficiaries on those 401k plans. Make sure that all of those beneficiary designations are set up properly, because all retirement accounts pass outside of your will. All assets that are owned jointly or have a beneficiary attached to the asset or a payable on death status passes outside of your will. So we need to coordinate what's included in your will, what's passing outside of your will, and how both work together for a complete plan. I often have people come in and they think that all of their assets are passing pursuant to their will, and they've given no attention to the beneficiary designations on their 401ks and IRAs, and that could mess up an estate plan more than it could be helpful. So you want to make sure that you're looking at the global picture. You also want to make sure that your relatives who may be providing for you are doing the correct planning and have the correct documents in place. So when I have parents come in who have trans children, for instance, they will say to me, well, I want to provide for my son or my daughter, but my son or my daughter was previously the opposite of whatever they're saying. So let's give the example of my son. My son and my daughter was previously my daughter. My son was previously my daughter. So I'm not sure exactly what I need to do. I don't need to, I need to know if I need to change my current will, which indicates my daughter, or if I need to just specify in a new will my son, or how I need to arrange that. And I tell them, well, it will only result in confusion to the court and to anybody that has the ability to potentially contest your will, to leave somebody that states she is your daughter when he is really your son at this point in your life. And your parents, in preparing those documents, need to be more gender neutral and use the term child instead of son or daughter. This way, even if you're contemplating a change in the future, they have you covered. They need to use the name or the designation spouse as opposed to husband or wife, because if there is some kind of change, either through their children and their children's spouse or their own spouse, which happens very frequently as well, then the will, which provides for a specific designation such as husband and wife, will not be questioned. So at this point in time, I guess we have some time, but we do like to leave time for questions, either on the health side or the legal side, or potentially for both. And when I say potentially for both, I sort of skipped around and I didn't say that part of the life planning aspects also involves name changes and potentially gender marker changes. And you need to work with your healthcare providers with respect to the right timing for each of those, and within your own mental head to come up with the right timing for each of those also, because they're very important for proper mental functioning, to know that you have the right name designation attached to all of your documents, that you have the right gender marker attached to all of your documents. I'll never forget the example years ago of a transgender client that I had who told me that every time she crossed the Canadian border, which was frequently for work, she had a panic attack because her driver's license had a different name on it. She presented in a different fashion. So what she often did was stop at a rest stop before and change into the clothing that would have her look like the gender on her driver's license or her passport or whatever is going to be necessary to get her across the border. So you want to look at all of those things. A name change is not difficult at all. It does require a court petition, but it's a relatively simple procedure, usually doesn't involve a court hearing at all. And a gender marker change is actually easier now than a name change, in that you would not need Dr. Rosenthal to specify in a written document that you've gone through any kind of a surgical process, or that you have the mental recognition of gender expression. You can just sign an affidavit on your own accord in New York at this point to allow your gender marker to be changed. So with that being said, any questions?
Joe, I just want to clarify one thing I think you said. So I think it's very true that the gender marker change in New York, it just can be self-attestation. But for example, if you want your passport changed or your social security card changed, then I think you do need a letter, although it does no longer have to be notarized by a provider in order to provide that information. So there is differences between federal and state laws as it applies to the difference between like a driver's license and a passport, if I'm correct. Is that accurate?
You're absolutely correct. And different governmental organizations have different rules also. So in New York City, for instance, you're right. You do need the physician's statement. Correct.
Exactly.
For driver's license.
Right, and there's differences that you'll see, and that's something that we engage with all the time in our program, and have those letters readily available, because those are questions that come up all the time, and they're really important. I think it's a really important point that you brought up, is that someone's gender identity, it's one thing to do social transition or consider medical interventions, but really having the world be able to present you with the name that you want to go by or use the pronouns that you want to do is really important. And that becomes really important not only for these legal documents, but also as people, I see this a lot for people that are getting ready to graduate from college or from high school, and they want a diploma or a license, for example, if they want to practice nursing in the state, that has their professional designation, which matches the name that they want to be represented by. And so these things become very essential, because it may be okay when you're in college, people will call you whatever they want to call you. But the fact is that you want your diploma to say what your name is, as you want the world to know it, so you can hang it up on the wall, or the wall behind you, as I see the same thing, right? So I think these are the things that we end up having that become really important. And I think documents or changing document's sake isn't necessarily important, but changing a document when it impacts your life. So if you're getting a job and you want to, for example, make sure your social security card aligns with your gender identity and your name that you're looking for, so that your health insurance can then, which is provided by your job, aligns. These things make a big difference for individuals when you have these things interacting with one another. And it's really important that you are able to do things that are going to be able to give you the life experience that you're looking for, that are going to make a big difference. And this is really where medical legal things kind of come back and forth. And so I'm not a lawyer, and I won't give legal advice, but I think it is important that you look at these issues, and they become really important for my trans patients. It's great that we're talking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a number of name change clinics in New York also. I'm a part of one at the Nassau County Bar Association. So if somebody is interested, they should call their local bar association as well to find out if there are clinics being sponsored.
Great. I think one thing that you brought up also that I wanted to kind of highlight is that as a physician, when we're unfortunately looking at end-of-life issues, having clarity about what my patients want is so essential and so important. So following kind of some of the documents that you spoke about, at least from the clinical perspective, understanding a healthcare proxy, understanding a living will, and understanding what someone's DNR or DNI orders are, which is all kind of contained within these documents, really helps me make sure I understand what my patient wants, and also what, if my patient hasn't specified a certain situation, who my patient wants me to talk to about this. How do we have this conversation? Do we talk to someone's partner about it, or do I talk to their two parents or their three brothers and sisters? And so these are really important conversations, and that really make a big difference to me as a practicing clinician, to be able to have some of these documents that you're speaking about, because they make a big difference in patients' lives and really add a lot of clarity. As a note that you kind of had about the original will, I always would say that if you have one of these legal documents regarding your healthcare, they don't do as much good in your safe as they do in your doctor's hands. So it's important to keep a copy where you can access them, but you also want to make sure that your medical provider knows what your needs are and what those desires are, so that if something happens, your medical provider has that information on file and already knows what's current. And then if you do change those documents, that you update that information with your medical provider so that they have that information that's currently on file, so we can make sure we're serving your needs as you see them as they come through.
Excellent points. Do you need a second career, perhaps, as a paralegal? I'm looking for one.
No, but I think these are really interesting things. It's where the law and medicine kind of interact, and I think that's really what's important. Is that, you know, it's important that you have the legal documents that support your medical decisions, but it's also important that your transition in your medical direction that we're talking about, you're able to craft the law to be able to make sure that it can work to your advantage to meet your needs. And so this is really where some of the things that we talk about, I'm going to prescribe PrEP, and you're not necessarily going to be prescribing PrEP, and you're going to be making an estate plan, and I'm not going to be making an estate plan, but some of these issues really do directly interact, and I think those are really fascinating points of conversation.
Absolutely.
if there's anyone that has questions, they can certainly put those questions either in the Q&A section or in the chat section. I do see a great question that came into the Q&A section that came through that I wanted to answer. And the question is in general, are there two sexes but more than two genders? And so I think this is really an important question, and we can really talk about it. So the way that we're looking at things, I think that the terminology I prefer to use is sex assigned at birth. And the reason I say sex assigned at birth is what happens is the baby is born, the doctor holds up the baby and says, it's a boy or it's a girl. The baby doesn't say, hi, I'm a boy. So this is not something that is being generated by the child. It's something that's assigned by the medical establishment based off of external genitalia. So when we're looking at this gender, the sex assigned at birth, I really think we're talking about largely sex, which is determined at birth, largely determined by external genitalia. Classically, those that was male or female, but currently in New York City, but not in Nassau County, you can actually have an X appear as your gender on your birth certificate. So there's three options. There's M, F, and X on New York City, but not anywhere else in New York State at the current time. And so there are three genders that we can exist. Within the healthcare setting, we typically look at things, three sexes at birth, that we can identify. In the healthcare setting, we typically also define people as male, female, or other, and other can be people that are intersex that may have unclear external genitalia or differentiations of sexual differentiation at birth. We're not sure if someone, for example, has both testes and a vagina. So depending on what's happened, those are possibilities that exist. And so that's also another sex option that's available, which is really kind of an intersex, which in New York City would be actually defined with an X frequently. And outside of New York City, there's kind of a requirement by the system to pick a bimodal distribution of either M or F, which is probably neither accurate. Regarding genders, there's probably, there's multiple different expressions of gender identity. So if we're thinking about gender identity, I usually talk about categories, and we are able to ask this in all of our ambulatory settings at Northwell Health. For gender identity, we ask people what your gender identity is, and people's answers can be male, female, trans female, gender nonconforming, non-binary, other, or withheld. And so we offer the variety of different choices that kind of fill into these categories. And there's many other variations that exist here, but I think that it's important for us to remember that there's differentiation. When we're talking about gender identity, we also realize that some people prefer to identify as male and consider themselves male, not trans male. They don't think of themselves as trans male, they think of themselves as being male. They were assigned female at birth and they identify as male now. And that's important for us to remember, that their gender identity is male in that situation and not trans male, just because there is a history of being trans in the past or being assigned a different gender at birth. So I think the concept or the nexus between the terminology of gender and sex is actually very important and very interesting. I'm sitting on a national committee that we're actually looking at things about changing some of the terminology, because really in healthcare, we really want to know, what does your anatomy say? What was your birth gender say? What do your chromosomes say? All of these things matter. But what we really need to remember is that gender identity is, as Cecilia Gentili, who's a trans activist and someone who's a friend that's in New York City. She's also an actress on Pose and does a lot of great work for the community or whatever, says that your gender identity is what's between your ears, not what's between your hips. And I think it's really important for us to remember that your gender identity is how you conceive and think about yourself, rather than any anatomical or physical attribution that you may have, and certainly separate from your sexual orientation or who you love. So that was a long answer to a very good question.
Okay, well, Roy, do you want to finish up with a summary of our next couple of programs?
I was thinking you were about to ask me to summarize today. I put in the chat a link to all of the future webinars. You can learn more about them, the subject of each of them, sign up for all of them. Also, a bio for Mr. Milizio and Dr. Rosenthal and their contact info. We encourage you to visit, to sign up, and to share it as widely as possible. Our next webinar is going to be on June 10th. It will be about trans health and LGBTQ representation, as well as estate planning, followed by June 17th, which will focus on LGBTQ fertility, as well as surrogacy, adoption, assisted reproduction, and family law, which will feature Dr. Randy Heather Goldman, who's an OBGYN and a specialist. And after that, we will be announcing more, as well as new exciting ventures. So stay tuned.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for attending, and happy Pride.
Happy Pride. It's been great being with you. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.